You're listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the support link in the upper right-hand corner. If you're new to the podcast and Dr. Heiser's approach to the Bible, click on New Start Here at nakedbiblepodcast.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 448, 1 Samuel 2, verse 12 through 36. I'm the layman, Trey Strickland, and he's the scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser. Well, Mike, looks like we're competitors this week.
Yes, we are.
And
we are in our fantasy football league. For those who haven't followed the podcast and don't know what time of year it is.
Yeah, and if you don't, shame on you. But seriously, Mike, how nervous and scared are you to face me? Because I am 4-1, only behind your brother, and I got a pretty good team. So I know you're nervous.
Not too much. I mean, I'm kind of used to it now. Used to all the injuries and whatnot.
Used to losing. You're used to losing. I get that. I'm
used to struggling. Yeah, in this league I am. So the pugnacious pugs are. I think I'm 2-3. Yeah. So I got to climb back to 500. Got a few points in that dreadful Washington-Chicago game Thursday night.
Yeah,
but we'll see if that helps me.
It's not, Mike. I'm sorry. There's not much you can do against my team. But thanks for playing. I mean, thanks for trying. It's appreciate.
Right. All I'm caring about is getting into the playoffs, because anything can happen there. Maybe I'll be at full strength then. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, Mike, I'm enjoying switching gears here. 1 Samuel, getting some good feedback, and everybody was pleasantly surprised and looking forward to it. And we're going to finish out chapter 2 today.
Yep, we are. So let's just jump in and read 1 Samuel 2, verses 12 through 36, and then we'll jump into the content. So I'm reading again from ESV. Now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. How's that for a beginning? The custom of the priest with the people was that when any man offered sacrifice, the priest's servant would come while the meat was boiling with a 3-pronged fork in his hand, and he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. All that the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. This is what they did at Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. Moreover, before the fat was burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, "Give meat for the priest to roast, for he will not accept boiled meat from you, but only raw." And if the man said to him, "Let them burn the fat first, and then take as much as you wish," he would say, "No, you must give it now. And if not, I will take it by force." Thus the sin of the young men was very great in the sight of the Lord, for the men treated the offering of the Lord with contempt. Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy, clothed with a linen ephod, and his mother used to make for him a little robe and take it to him each year when she went up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. Then Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, "May the Lord give you children by this woman for the petition she asked of the Lord." So then they would return to their home. And indeed, the Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the boy Samuel grew in the presence of the Lord. Now Eli was very old, and he kept hearing all that his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they lay with the women who were serving at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And he said to them, "Why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings from all these people. No, my sons, it is no good report that I hear the people of the Lord spreading abroad. If someone sins against a man, God will mediate for him. But if someone sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him?" But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for it was the will of the Lord to put them to death. Now the boy Samuel continued to grow both in stature and favor with the Lord and also with man. And there came a man of God to Eli and said to him, "Thus says the Lord, did I indeed reveal myself to the house of your father when they were in Egypt, subject to the house of Pharaoh? Did I choose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar to burn incense, to bear an ephod before me? I gave to the house of your father all my offerings by fire from the people of Israel. Why then do you scorn my sacrifices and my offerings that I commanded for my dwelling? and honor your sons above me by fattening yourselves on the choicest parts of every offering of my people Israel. Therefore the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I promise that your house and the house of your father should go in and out before me forever. But now, the Lord declares, far be it from me, for those who honor me I will honor, and those who despise me shall be lightly esteemed. Behold, the days are coming when I will cut off your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your house. Then in distress you will look with envious eye on all the prosperity that shall be bestowed on Israel. And there shall not be an old man in your house forever. The only one of you whom I shall not cut off from my altar shall be spared to weep his eyes out, to grieve his heart. And all the descendants of your house shall die by the sword of men. And this that shall come upon your 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, shall be the sign to you. Both of them shall die on the same day. And I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. And I will build him a sure house, and he shall go in and out before my anointed forever. And everyone who is left in your house shall come to implore him for a piece of silver or a loaf of bread, and shall say, please put me in one of the priest's places, that I may eat a morsel of bread. That's the entirety of the rest of 1 Samuel chapter 2. So we want to start with just generally, what is the passage about? Again, we're just modifying what we do here a little bit to get through these passages. And so we'll start this way. What is the passage about? First, the passage is about the corruption of Eli's sons and his negligence in dealing with the problem. That's kind of obvious from what we read. But it also marks the passing of the Elides, that is Eli and his family, his line of his priestly lineage. Marks the passing of the Elides and begins the transition towards Samuel functioning as God's priest, or at least sort of like a priest. We'll comment in a little bit that Samuel does priestly things, but he's not actually from the line of Aaron, that he really needed to be a full priest. But anyway, recall from our last episode, that Samuel's line could be traced back to Jacob through Levi. So Samuel was a Levite, but he wasn't a descendant of Aaron. And he's going to be this transitional figure to take over from Eli in some respect, but also until this other priestly figure will come, and we'll get to that in a moment. As far as the wider context, let's just observe a few things here. First of all, the passage begins to highlight the contrast between Samuel and the Elides. Eli's, again, priestly lineage. There's what the writer does here is he uses the literary technique of coupling, that is, putting together and comparing characters. So if you read through the passage, there are negative comments about Eli's household in 1 Samuel 2, 12 through 17, and 22 through 25, and 27 through 36, that alternate with positive observations about Samuel's growing relationship with the Lord, like in 1 Samuel 2, 18 through 21, and verse 26. Samuel is described as being clothed in a linen ephod, marking him as the contrasting priestly figure to Eli and his sons, even as a young boy. And here we return to this point about Samuel not being from Aaron. We have to note this, that Samuel was not a descendant of Aaron, so he could not serve in the office of priest. Rather, he was a Levite, and so he could occupy parts of sacred space there at the tabernacle and perform certain tabernacle duties. He was permitted to offer sacrifices, at least certain sacrifices, but he was not the Hebrew word kohen, an Aaronic priest. Again, we'll also return to that a little bit later again as we hit some other things in the chapter. 1 Samuel 2 also sets up the next chapter, if you really think about it. Here in chapter 2, Samuel is functioning as a Levite and doing certain priestly things, whereas chapter 3 will introduce him in the role of a prophet. This is when God starts to come to him and speak to him face to face. Now, Chisholm, in his commentary, remarks on this contrast as follows. He writes, Samuel's arrival at Shiloh in 1:28 and 2:11 provides a contrastive backdrop for the author's negative portrait of Eli and his sons. The narrator alternates between negative accounts of Eli's house and brief positive observations about Samuel's growing relationship with the Lord. This culminates in the account of how Samuel becomes the Lord's prophet and reiterates the earlier judgment upon Eli's house. That's chapter 3 through the first verse of chapter 4. The narrator's positive assessment of Samuel helps to establish the latter's credentials, which is an important part of his strategy in promoting David as God's chosen king. Because, let me break in here. After all, 1 Samuel is going to be about the rise of David ultimately. Back to Chisholm, he writes, this account, along with the one that follows in chapter 3, also contributes in another way to the narrator's goal of presenting David, not Saul, as God's chosen king. The rejection of Eli's house and the announcement of a new priestly dynasty establish a pattern that will be repeated with Saul and David. Just as God withdraws his promise of dynastic succession from Eli and gives it to another, chapter 2, verses 30 through 36, so he will do with Saul, later in chapter 13, verses 13 and 14. The house of Saul will not be able to appeal to God's election as unconditional, for Eli's experience demonstrates that disobedience can result in forfeiture of the divine promise. The Lord has the sovereign right to reject rebels and to accomplish his purposes through other and more worthy instruments. That's the end of the Chisholm quote. I'm going to come back to this theme as well of election, because I think that, well, we might as well do it now. This latter paragraph, this comment that Chisholm had about the house of Saul not being able to depend on God's election of his household as unconditional is important. Because that last paragraph is in reference to 1 Samuel 2, 30 through 36, which, we just read. I'll just read a little bit of it here again. Let's see, verse 30. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me, for those who honor me I will honor, and those who despise me shall be lightly esteemed. Behold, the days are coming when I will cut off your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your house. You keep reading. This is round the heels of, let's see, the way verse 30 begins. I promised that your house and the house of your father should go in and out before me forever. In and out being a reference to going in and out in the sacred spaces, the tabernacle, and later the temple. And here God goes back on that. He rejects it. So God can revoke his choice, his elective choice, when apostasy becomes a problem. I think this shows again how we misunderstand election. This is another example of God changing election. So any talk of election, which begins with God's choice of Israel, needs to account for episodes and passages like this one. And too often they are ignored or missed or not factored into the discussion. Election is assumed to be something that is guaranteed, and it's not. Here again, God did this with all Israel. Israel was elect. Every Israelite was elect as a member of the nation, but yet God sends the nation into exile because of apostasy. Here God rejects Eli's priesthood where he promised. Again, verse 30, the Lord declares, I promised that your house and the house of your father should go in and out before me forever. But now the Lord declares, forget it. Forget it. It's not going to happen because you and your sons are apostates. So any talk of election that we do, whether it's in the Old or the New Testament, it always begins with the Old Testament. In typical Reformed theology, they'll take this back to Israel's election, which they have to do to be consistent. But then they're inconsistent in their election theology by not factoring in verses like this and passages like this. You need to do that. Again, election is not about guaranteed salvation or guaranteed anything. It's about access. It's about access to the truth, to the true oracles of God. It's about an elective status that can be withdrawn if you apostatize. And that has ramifications, again, for how we view election in the New Testament as well. But anyway, I think that was important to point out. Secondly, second observation, note how the judgments of chapter 2 address the apostasy of Israel in the period of the judges and the resulting Philistine oppression, God doesn't raise up the military leader to fix the problem first. He first cleans house at the tabernacle. This is God's methodology, to clean up the spiritual side first. And Harry Hophner writes in this regard, considering the prominent role that warfare with the Philistines plays in 1 Samuel, one might have expected the opening chapters to focus on that threat to Israel. Instead, our text reveals a more sinister and deadly enemy to God's people, a cancer at the very spiritual heart of the people, in her priests, who were responsible for teaching the people and mediating their prayers and sacrifices to God. The book of Judges, which forms the essential introduction to 1 Samuel, demonstrates that a succession of military victories over outside oppressors was insufficient to bring blessing to the nation when its spiritual condition was cold and careless, as it is repeatedly shown to be in that book, especially Judges 17 and 19. At this point, the nation of Israel needed more than a king, even a godly one like David. It needed a complete cleansing in its priestly leadership and a revival of the prophetic voice. If Eli and his sons vividly illustrate the degradation of the priesthood, the fact that Samuel's voice broke a long silence in the prophetic ministry, i.e., 1 Samuel 3:1, and really the whole chapter 1 Samuel 3. This shows that Israel was starving for the guidance of the living God, the God who had liberated it from Egyptian slavery and planted it in the land promised to Abraham. That new faithful leadership would emerge in Hannah's son, Samuel. So those are two sort of macro observations. What about some nuggets in the passage now, parking on a few specific things in the passage? First one I would get into is the sins of Eli's sons. There were two main sins here. The first one was taking from the sacrifices, especially the proper priestly share of the sacrifices. The phrase custom of the priests refers to Deuteronomy 18:3. Just read that for you. And this shall be the priest's due from the people, from who those offering a sacrifice, whether an ox or a sheep, they shall give to the priest the shoulder and the two cheeks and the stomach. And that's what the priests were supposed to get. That was the custom of the priests. Again, we see how the characters are judged by Deuteronomy content. Remember the Deuteronomic history idea. But we have to recall Hophner's pushback on the Deuteronomistic historian idea. We should also note that the priestly share is also described in more detail in Leviticus 7, 28 through 34, so it's not exclusively Deuteronomy. The sons of Eli were not satisfied with the Lord's provision and basically took what they wanted, verse 14. Further, the fat of the animal was to be burned first. It was part of the Lord's portion, his own food offering, according to Leviticus 21, 17 through 22. Eli's sons were serving themselves before God, even at times by force. And resistance to Eli's sons from lay Israelites shows that average Israelite worshipers knew the law of Moses on the matter. They knew better. So we ought to recognize that the law of Moses, either by means of Leviticus or Deuteronomy, pre-existed this period and people had been taught the rules. Now their second main sin was sleeping with the women who served in the tabernacle. This is mentioned in chapter 2, verse 22. There's a hard-to-miss contrast here between the Phinehas, who was Samuel's son and one of the perpetrators, and his namesake, the other Phinehas from the era of Moses. Lightheart comments on this in his commentary. The earlier Phinehas pierced through a man and a woman who were fornicating in the camp, Numbers 25, 1 through 9. But at Shiloh, an anti-Phinehas fornicated in the tabernacle precincts. This fornication also had symbolic significance. In Leviticus 18, sexual sins are described as an illicit uncovering nakedness, and the language parallels the language used of approaches to the sanctuary. There is thus a conceptual parallel between the inviolability of the tabernacle and the inviolability of a woman. And the inviolability of the tabernacle is symbolized by the virgin women who served there. Hophni and Phinehas, however, the sons of Samuel, violated these women, a sign that the tabernacle itself was being violated. Uncovering the nakedness of the women was as much as ripping down the curtains of the tabernacle. Instead of guarding the dedicated virgins, the sons of Eli treated them as sacred prostitutes. Second nugget to look at here, Samuel's status as a Levite and not an Aaronic priest. So here we come back to this point once again. We noted this earlier. Samuel was limited in what he could do on sacred space, but his presence was still used to contrast godly spiritual leadership with Eli and his worthless sons. Hophni explains, he writes, when Yahweh announced his judgment on Eli's house in 1 Samuel 2:27-36, and later in chapter 3, verses 11 through 18, he promised to raise up a faithful priest, a Kohen Naaman, to take its place in 1 Samuel 2:35 and 36. This priest was not Samuel, but Zadok, who would arrive on the scene after David was king and had captured Jerusalem. In the meantime, God continued to use priests of the family of Eli. Ahimelech, who presided at Nob, aided David in both a cultic, 1 Samuel 22:10, and a practical way, 1 Samuel 21:1-9, at the cost of his life, 1 Samuel 22:63, and his Abiathar accompanied during his feud, providing him with guidance through oracular inquiries. The priestly oracular ability overlapped with the ministry of prophets such as Samuel, Nathan, and Gad in providing divine guidance to Israel's first two kings. It was only when Solomon chose Zadok alone to be high priest, rejecting Abiathar, who was from Eli's line, that the line of Eli was finally eliminated from serving Yahweh as priests to Israel and her kings. As for Samuel, he was a seer. The Hebrew word is chazah, or roeh, and a prophet, navi, par excellence, greater than any who preceded him since the time of Moses. And Hophni references Deuteronomy 18:15 and Deuteronomy 34:10 here. Deuteronomy 18:15, remember, says, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me. This is Moses speaking. From among you, from your brothers, it is to him you shall listen. So Hophni considers Samuel in that train, in that vein of prophetic fulfillment. He writes, a good case can be made that prior to this prophecy's ultimate fulfillment in Jesus, it was Samuel who best fit the portrait of the prophet like Moses referred to in Deuteronomy 18. His prophetic utterances never erred, and he gets that from 1 Samuel 3:19-21, which reads, and Samuel grew and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. So when it comes to Jesus' later ultimate status as the prophet like unto Moses, we have something here that really gets its start with Samuel. That's Hophni's point. One last point, and this is more or less me intervening, even though Hophni brings it up. I think there's something to be noted here between the parallel wording of 1 Samuel 2:26 and later of Jesus in Luke 2:52. 1 Samuel 2:26 says, now the boy Samuel continued to grow, both in stature and in favor with the Lord and also with man. It sounds a lot like Luke 2:52. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. Again, there's a link there established between Jesus and Samuel we don't want to miss. So as far as distinguishing what an Aaronic Kohen priest and Samuel were authorized to do, David Samora summarizes this in his own commentary. Recall that the context for this is the tabernacle itself, which was at Shiloh. Samora writes, summarizing the chief duties of the priesthood as follows. Number 1, to go up to my altar, that is the sum of actions performed on the altar, including burning offerings, as an aroma pleasing to the Lord. He gets this from Leviticus 1:9 and other passages. 2, the priests were to burn incense. This is Exodus 30, verse 7 and Numbers 17:5. In the holy place before the Lord was where this was to be done, Leviticus 16:13. Note that the incense, the ketoret, was burned on a special altar, that's the altar of incense, and not on that of the food offering. Its purpose is to make the cloud to conceal the atonement cover above the testimony, again, to conceal the lid of the Ark of the Covenant, so that the priest, the high priest, will not die. It's Leviticus 16:13. Third, priests were to wear the ephod. This is Leviticus 8:7. Now this ephod, Tzimora writes, is to be distinguished from Samuel's linen ephod in verse 18, chapter 2. This ephod refers to the high priest's ephod of Exodus 28:5-30, which included the jeweled breastplate and the Urim and the Thummim. It appears in 1 Samuel 23:6 and 1 Samuel 30:7 in connection with oracular decisions. So Samuel could do certain things, but he couldn't do others. He's still this transitional figure, but he is not, again, the prophet like unto Moses, or again, this main sort of priestly replacement either. He's a go-between, he's an in-between, he's a transitional figure. Third nugget, the unidentified man of God in chapter 2, verses 27 and following. Now let's just read that again real briefly. And there came a man of God to Eli and said to him, Thus says the Lord, did I indeed reveal myself to the house of your father? That's a reference to Aaron, when they were in Egypt, subject to the house of Pharaoh, so on and so forth. So there's this unidentified man of God. We're never given a name. And the fact that God sends a man of God, think about it, to Eli, who's the priest, is indicative again of the spiritual distance between Eli and Yahweh. Yahweh has to send him a man of God, a prophetic figure. He's not speaking to him just by himself. There's no relationship there between Eli and Yahweh. Now, on the Hebrew phrase, Ish Elohim, man of God, Hophni writes as follows. Although the narrator informs us in 1 Samuel 9:9 that in Samuel's time, the word for prophet was roeh, seer, not navi, prophet. The word that the servant uses is neither of these, but a third one, Ish Elohim, a man of God. This phrase had none of the moral connotations associated with it in today's language. In other words, we use it today to refer to a godly or devout person, although the spokesman of Yahweh certainly sought to obey his Torah. Instead, the focus of the phrase was a man who channeled messages from God, or in non-Israelite parlance, from the gods. In Hittite, remember, Hophni was a Hittite scholar, so he's going to dip into Hittite from time to time. In Hittite, such a person was referred to as either a shiunianza, which describes one controlled or perhaps temporarily possessed by a god, shiuni, or a shiunas antuksha, a man or person of the gods. And although we never see Samuel behaving like an ecstatic, there certainly were examples of ecstatic behavior by true prophets of Yahweh. For instance, 1 Samuel 10:9-13. See Saul among the prophets. Here the expression is indefinite, here in chapter 2, a man of God. When the phrase describes a specific named individual, it is always definite. Instead of Ish Elohim, you would get Ish Ha Elohim, the man of God. Examples of such specific individuals include Moses, Deuteronomy 33:1. Just read that to you. This is the blessing with which Moses, the man of God, blessed the people of Israel before his death. Another example is Shemaiah in 1 Kings 12:22. But the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God. The hallmark of a genuine man of God or seer, again, it was this title. Also, it's whatever he says always comes true. Hophni writes, compare this description in 1 Samuel 3:19 of Samuel's reliable prophecies. Yahweh was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. In other words, Yahweh let none of his predictions fail or prayers go unanswered. Fourthly, the vocabulary of fattening and the subsequent description of Eli as very heavy or fat is ironic. In the prophecy of doom from the man of God, Eli and his sons are accused of making themselves fat on the sacrifices of the people. That's chapter 2, verse 29. There is little irony here as we learn later that Eli was indeed fat. That's in 1 Samuel 4:18. Let me read it to you. This is when the ark of God is taken and Hophni and Phinehas die, and so does Eli. We read this. As soon as he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell over backward from his seat by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died. For the man was old and heavy. He had judged Israel 40 years. So heavy or fat is from the same Hebrew word as glory or honor. So Lightheart comments to this effect as follows. Heavy is keved, and glory is kavod. Eli is glorifying himself by fattening himself with the Lord's food, instead of glorifying God by offering food to him. In this regard, it should not be missed. There's also some irony here, that the cursings Eli and his family will experience in judgment are described as not having enough to eat. And we read this in 1 Samuel 2, 26 through 36. Let me just read you that. Verse 36, and everyone who is left in your house, God says to Eli, through this man of God, shall come to implore him for a piece of silver or a loaf of bread, and shall say, please, put me in one of the priest's places, that I may eat a morsel of bread. So the contrast here is that Eli and his sons are stealing from the offerings and making themselves fat, literally. But one of the curses on their lineage as it begins to wane and be stamped out is they're not going to have enough to eat. They're going to be starving. They're not going to have this livelihood anymore. Please put me in one of the priest's places that I may eat a morsel of bread. So this is the nature of God's cursing. And it's a direct commentary on this fattening language, which creates irony here in the text. Lastly, our last nugget is Eli's failure. So this is our last point before we wrap up. Lightheart does a nice job of summarizing this defect or this problem. He writes, when the Lord later spoke to Samuel, he said that Eli's great sin was his failure to rebuke his sons. That's in 1 Samuel 3:13. Eli did rebuke his sons, but did a poor job of it. And we read that in verses 23 through 25. Let me just read that again here. Eli said to his sons, why do you do such things? And laying with the women who were at the tent of meeting. For I hear of your evil dealings from all these people. No, my sons, it is no good report that I hear. The people of the Lord spreading abroad. If someone sins against man, God will mediate for him. But if someone sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him? But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for it was the will of the Lord to put them to death. I mean, God was aiming at judging them anyway. So they're not going to listen. But Eli does a poor job, Lightheart points out. Lightheart continues this way with this commentary. Eli heard that his sons were committing fornication, but did not address that point in his rebuke. Eli's rebuke was too general to cut to the heart. Failure to restrain right or high-handed sin is judged as a high-handed sin, which cannot be atoned by sacrifice or offering. Father's failure to restrain sons will be a persistent theme throughout the books of Samuel. Eli rebuked his sons, but lamely and ineffectually. Saul rebuked both David and Jonathan, but for their righteous works rather than for their wickedness. And David will fail to restrain his sons. It's the end of the Lightheart quote. So again, the problem here is Eli is not specific, and he doesn't just outright remove them. He does not do a good job of protecting sacred space and protecting the integrity of the sacrifices and of the tabernacle itself. He just doesn't do it. He just says, well, this is what I hear. I hear stuff going on that doesn't sound good to me, that you two are doing. As though they're going to just change after hearing that. They didn't, and he didn't remove them. And that was his great defect and his great sin against the Lord, according to 1 Samuel 3:13. That's our treatment of 1 Samuel chapter 2 here, the rest of it. So again, there was a lot in here, again, to be talked about and to be observed. And next time we're going to get into chapter 3, which, if you've read Unseen Realm, or if you've heard me lecture about the two powers, the two Yahweh figures that are behind the two powers in Judaism, we get into 1 Samuel 3 in that respect with the word of the Lord. We'll do a little of that next time. I'm not going to rehearse the content of Unseen Realm. There are other things to see in there. But we'll get into that and add a few other observations in chapter 3. So look forward to that.
Mike, you were talking about Shiloh and stuff, and, we were there when we went to Israel, and bringing up images of that.
Yeah, we were.
It's amazing how going there, how, I don't know, it just does something when you read the Bible.
Yeah, you could see the dimensions of where the tabernacle had been laid out.
Yeah, they've got an amazing, if you ever go to Israel, you got to go to Shiloh, because they have one of this like this circular presentation room where you sit down and they basically project what it looks like as you're looking at the ruins. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they have a little presentation.
Yeah, they do a good job with it. Yep.
Yeah, it's amazing.
They did a good job with it. Yeah. It is a memorable thing. And Shiloh is we have to tell people that Shiloh is in disputed territory between Israel and the Palestinians. And so not every tour group gets to go there. You have to gain permission to go there. And so our tour, again, we were fortunate to have a guide that was able to visit that place. So, it's not a guarantee if you go to Israel, you'll get to see Shiloh. So it's something to look up in your tour itinerary, or at least ask about.
Yeah, if you can go, I highly recommend it. It's pretty amazing. Just holding the history, every place over there, every inch of that country, it's just history, and it's crazy.
Yep, there's something there. Yep,
brings back good memories. All right, Mike. Looking forward to chapter 3 next week, and with that, I want to thank everybody for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.